Yes, sir.
Yep.
Okay. Well, I am speaking with Brian Fies. It's always a treat. We've actually chatted for more than one occasion, which is great. So this is, I feel like, uh, be very comfortable, familiar territory for us. But we've never talked about that last mechanical monster, which is the book we're going to be talking about, a new deluxe hardcover edition. There we go. We're twins.
There, in stereo.
Mr. Fies has won. Well, you won the first webcomic award for the Eisners for Mom's Cancer. Twice this book has been nominated an Eisner Award. Thank you so much for doing this.
Oh, it's great to see you again. Thank you for asking me.
Well, thank you. I'm going to jump in with my fun question, jumping off point, which I think might inspire more than one comment. Now, the book, for everyone, you got to know this is based on the 1941 Fleischer Studios animated feature. And so I have been doing a little bit of digging, and I realized that if you think about it, what movie would this been accompanying? Since I imagine it was a short that folks saw in the theater. And so I looked at I looked at the possibilities, and that's what would match up with the same release date is the night of January 16th, which is like the most obscure title. It's just a movie that's no one's ever heard of. It just has been lost in time. But I think a matchup that would make sense, that would be so much fun, would be if this was matched up with Sullivan's Travels, which came out a few months later.
Wouldn't that be wonderful? Yeah, that'd be fantastic.
But I want to give this over to you and ask you, when you first saw that animated feature and it clicked, what was that like? And it clicked as something that was possible to develop into a comic.
I don't remember. I've always been aware of these shorts. Because they went into the public domain in the 60s, they were kind of these movies, along with Coco the Clown and the other Fleischer cartoons, were the kind of things that they would show, at 5:30 in the morning on your local UHF station, if anyone remembers what UHF is. So you'd get up in the morning and you'd make yourself a bowl of cereal when you're a kid, and you'd sit down, you watch these, these old cartoons. I remember seeing them when I was a kid. As an adult, I became more of a student of the medium and found all of the Fleischer Superman cartoons, which at that point were very poor copies that you could buy for $1 at Walmart on VHS, so for some reason, the Mechanical Monsters short just really appealed to me. I liked it sort of. First of all, the art is beautiful. The art is breathtaking on all of these old Fleischer Superman cartoons. It influenced Superman the Animated Series, or Superman and Batman the Animated Series in the 90s. Its influence continues to this day. Animators still study those cartoons and say, my God, look how beautiful cartoons can be. So I picked up on that. But I just always loved Mechanical Monsters because it had giant robots, and it had this absurd robot inventor who's dressed up in a tux. And why is he in a tuxedo? There's no reason for him to be in an formal evening wear, except he's a fancy fella who's clearly spent more money building these robots than he could ever get using them to commit crimes. So I always loved the beauty of the movie. I always enjoyed the absurdity of the character, and of course the heroism of Superman and Lois Lane. And but the idea of doing a sequel to it, I have no idea. The idea has just been with me for years and years. And I finally, a few years ago, just did it. Just developed a story and went for it. And one of the things you do when you put out a book is you get blurbs, and one of the nicest blurbs I got was from Paul Dini, who did some of those cartoons back in the 90s, who basically said that the story seems inevitable. Mm-hmm. If you know the original Mechanical Monsters, this seems like a story that had to have happened, even though it didn't exist until I made it up. And I thought that was really a beautiful way to put that. So I appreciated that.
Well, for this interview, I did a fresh read of the book, and then I saw that I had never seen that animated feature until recently, and it holds up so well. It feels modern, and it's very smooth like butter. So I'm going to include a link to everything that we talk about on my blog post, and I highly encourage folks to see that animated piece of masterwork. Fleischer Studios, for young folks that might not be aware, that's the animation, maybe the first time or the best time that animation was done of Betty Boop and Popeye.
Yeah,
And
that's true.
I just did a quick read, so maybe I need to make sure. But I think when they were bought out by Paramount, that's sort of was the beginning of the end. They did the Superman animation, but then that was it. I see that the Mr. Bug Goes to Town was the second and last animated feature they ever did for Paramount, and that was in December of 41. Right. So I don't know what happened. That was it for them. But
well, I'm not a student of Fleischer Studios, but as I recall, and I may be wrong on this, that Max and Dave Fleischer had some falling out too. The two brothers who ran the studio and wanted to go different directions, and I'm sure they were in some financial distress by the mid 40s. So I think the brothers went their separate ways and did different things, but I'd have to look that up. But in any case, yeah, Fleischer Studios was out of business by the mid 40s, and then you get the great era of Warner Brothers, Bugs Bunny, Daffy Duck during World War II kind of stuff. And but the Fleischers were pioneers, man. They invented stuff. Once in a while, you see one of these cartoons, I think, especially with Popeye, where they did this really wild 3D stuff where they shot the animation cells against a 3D model that they rotated. So it looked like the characters were moving through this landscape. And it was an actual model on like an 8-foot turntable. And they'd spin this thing around and then they'd, have Popeye walking through this. And it looks bizarre to modernize because you've never seen anything like it, but it's really effective. And they were just innovators. They were doing stuff like that all the time, some of which became standard in the industry and some of which, like the 3D rotating table, was kind of a really charming and weird one-off, but you can't look at the Fleischer cartoons without just seeing creativity and innovation on every second of film.
Oh, I really appreciate those observations, and I think I need to catch myself because I say I didn't see that until recently. I probably saw it, but I don't remember because we're of a generation where we were constantly consuming stuff coming off the black and white TV, the flickering black and white TV, the Saturday morning cartoons, and all the late night shows that we would watch, like the Twilight Zone. We were watching that as reruns, and a lot of the generation is loyal followers of reruns. They didn't see it the first time around, but it's a work of genius what you've done, because once people see the animation, they just have to be so highly appreciative of all the backstory you provide, all the development of the character, this villain, who I don't know if he has a proper name. One of the locals in the small town that he's doomed to be in gives him the name of Sparky. Does he have there's no other name for him, is there? He's never named. Is he? Or
they didn't give him a name in the they didn't name him in the movie. No, he's just all you know about him is the headline at the end that says "Inventor captured by Superman" or something like that. I came up with a name for him in an earlier version of the cartoon that became the book, the comic that became a book. I gave him the name Stannis Smith. Stannis because Stannis is tin. He's a tinsmith. And so I thought that was kind of clever, but I never had a chance to use it and decided that I didn't need to in this version. I left him anonymous in my version as he was in the original. But in my head, his name is Stannis Smith. Nobody knows that. This is a world exclusive you got here. I've never told anybody that before.
That's what I dig for, these little extra gems. So tell us a little bit about what led to this hardcover deluxe edition.
Well, First of all, I have the best publisher in the world, Abrams Books, and the best editor in the world, Charlie Kochman. All my books have been done with Charlie and with Abrams, and it's just been a great working relationship since Mom's Cancer, which came out in 2006. Well, it's a story because I did this as a web comic some time ago, a black and white web comic. I did The Last Pancake Monster, which is actually very similar to this version. I colored it and I added a few pages for the print version, but basically what you see in the print is what the web comic looked like. And I put it online myself, and it was later picked up by GoComics.com, which is the sort of online arm of Andrews McMeel Publishing, which is the syndicator of all the comic strips you know and love. So it got a lot of exposure that way. And as you mentioned graciously in your introduction, got a couple of Eisner Award nominations as a webcomic. And that was fine. That's all it had to be, all I needed it to be. I actually showed it to Charlie and Abrams at that point. And they were kind of, well, I don't know. I don't think so. And that's fine. They don't have to love everything I do. They don't have to publish it. No hard feelings at all. I was very happy to just have it be a webcomic, and not everything needs to be a book. And so, as you know, and in 2017, my house burned down in the Northern California wildfires, and I did a book called A Fire Story about that. And that came out and got a lot of press and notice, and did pretty well. And so after that, I was talking to Charlie about, well, what do you want to do next? And I said, well, I got some ideas. I got this, I got that. And Charlie says, let me take another look at that robot thing. And so here's a pro tip for all you, aspiring writers and authors out there. When a publisher comes to you and says, I'd like to publish that thing, you say yes. So that's my insight into that. But I alluded to there being an earlier version of this, and I learned something really important in making The Last Mechanical Monster. And that came about because in my first draft, it still had the inventor and the robot, but it had different characters. Lillian the engineer was sort of one of the characters, but there were a whole different cast of other characters. Helen the librarian wasn't in it. None of these other characters were in it. And I'd written the whole thing, and I started penciling and inking, and I'd gotten 100 pages into it. I'd written and drawn 100 pages of this version of the story. And I was just dreading sitting down in the morning to work on it. And I was finding reasons to procrastinate. And I was just not enjoying doing this at all. And I also at the same time realized that when I told people the story, when I described, what you working on, Brian? Well, I'm doing the story about an old man and a giant robot and blah, blah, blah. I realized that the story I was telling people was not actually the story I was writing and drawing, Mm-hmm. And so I realized that if I wasn't having fun doing this story, nobody was going to have fun reading it. I think that comes through the page, whatever joy or an emotion the creator is feeling, I think it suffuses through the page, and the reader picks up on that. If I weren't having fun doing it, nobody would have fun reading it, and it wasn't the story I wanted to tell. So I took those 100 completed pages and I flipped them all over, and I started drawing a new version of the story on the back, and that's the story, the version that became the webcomic and became the book. But what I learned was, I needed to go through that 100 pages. I needed to waste those months and months of work to get to the story I really wanted to tell. And so, some people are kind of aghast. They're like, "Oh my God, how could you do that? That sounds, what a loss. You must feel horrible." And I felt great because I had a better idea. And once I had a better idea, that old idea, I didn't need that old idea. I needed to go through that old idea to get to the better idea. So I learned something. That's what I learned from doing this project is don't fall for the sunk cost fallacy. If you get a better idea, then just swerve left and follow that better idea.
Well, that's the whole craft of writing. You don't get to the goal until the second or third or fourth draft. So that makes sense completely.
Yeah. Well, at the time I was a little nonplussed, like, oh crap, but I was happy to do it.
Yeah, you had all this. I mean, finished work for a cartoonist is, oh my goodness, that's a lot of work to go back and redo. So yeah. Have you? Well, you've learned a lot of tricks along the way. You've learned ways to draw quicker. That sometimes keeping something spare is fine. You were telling me about that
True.
in the fire story, and the mechanical monster. I don't think anything's missing. I mean, I feel like there's a nice lean quality. It seems like you've got that lean, mean technique down.
I appreciate that. Thank you, because I strive for that. I'm sure when we talked about this before, I said something like, when I redraw something, it's always to take lines out, not to add lines in. I'm always trying to simplify and pare down and polish and just get to that one line or one shape, one form that expresses exactly what I want it to say. And so I aim for that kind of, simple, clear line style. Not every cartoonist does, and it's not right for every project or every, what have you, but every aesthetic. But to me, that's real important, and I aim for that. So thank you. So you're exactly right. To me, half the trick of cartooning is knowing what to leave out. That's the skill, and I think I'm getting better and better at that.
I'm going to insert a few images along the way as we're talking, so that'll help give people some visual aids. I like some of the stuff that you bring in that I don't know what I'm a moron sometimes when it comes to math, or that's not my specialty. For you, physics and math or science are your specialty. So page 66, for instance, when you reference the ballistic arc, I imagine that's accurate.
Oh, guaranteed. Yeah, I wouldn't expect anybody who's listening to this remembers our earlier conversations, but I was a physics major and worked as a science writer for quite a while and worked as a chemist for probably 12 or 15 years, something like that. So to me, that's my secret sauce that I bring to whatever I do, is that kind of background and perspective. So yeah, the ballistic stuff and it's interesting because when I started this project, I really had to decide if for my own storytelling sensibility, if I was telling a science fiction story or a fantasy story. Because sometimes Superman is played either way. Superman can be either science fiction, in which he's an alien from another planet, or it can just be outlandish fantasy where nothing makes any darn sense. And I had to decide for myself if the Mechanical Monsters was fantasy or science fiction. And my angle into that was looking at the robot and trying to figure out how the robot worked. And there is no way the robot works, especially if his whole chest is hollow, as we see in the short, because Lois Lane climbs inside of the robot. And he's as hollow as he's like a clothes dryer or something, There's no way this thing works. So in my own mind, when I was writing the story, I decided this was a fantasy. This wasn't science fiction because there was just no way this robot works. Where's the battery? How does the propeller turn? How do his arms sprout the wings? It was impossible. So once I realized I was telling a fantasy story, I think that I can't say it changed the direction, but maybe it changed the tone a little bit. And I kind of leaned away from sort of the harder sciencey stuff, but the ballistic arc is right. There's a part in there where I say steel plate weighs, I forget what the answer is, but it's so many feet per square foot, and I looked that up. You can look that up in tables, and how much force a steel plate can actually take. Like, is it stronger than a speeding bullet? Is it more powerful than a locomotive? Well, no, but so I try to bring the science in, or at least filter things through the science lens, because that's sort of the way I try to see everything and do everything. But then you gotta kind of let it go sometimes and just say, you know what, I don't know how the robot works, but we're going to pretend that the people in this story know how the robot works.
It brings to mind Back to the Future for me, because I think there's an air of credibility, like the science stuff. Hey, I'll bet if I could get the professor down for coffee, we could really discuss the gigawatts and all of that. Like there's stuff in the background.
Yeah. Well, that's true. And, I did have to make some decisions. Like I decided the robot's brain, the artificial intelligence, which is just this amazing, that's as true genius invention as the artificial intelligence that runs this robot. I decided it was all based on vacuum tubes because that was the technology available in 1941. And this guy didn't have the wherewithal to invent transistors or integrated circuits. He did this. He made this most advanced artificial intelligence ever created with vacuum tubes. And I thought, that's right. That's, but I had to think that through and say, all right, what's available to him? How could he do it? Now, again, because this is if it were science fiction, I would say, well, there's no way you could do that with vacuum tubes. It's impossible to create an artificial intelligence with vacuum tubes. But in fantasy, this guy figured out how to do it.
Well, your stories is a delightful read for any age. It's very character driven. You feel sorry for the villain, or maybe you think he's getting his comeuppance. It goes up and down a little bit, and then you've got all the locals in the town who you get inside their minds. They want to do the right thing, help him, and then they're put off by him. That goes up and down too.
Well, he's a pain in the neck, but he's kind of, one thing I'm sort of commenting on, or I was thinking about as I was writing, was this sort of tendency we have to condescend to old people. And the older I get, the more I see it. Like, oh, aren't they sweet? And I wanted to come up with an old man who was scary as hell when he had to be. I mean, you don't underestimate this guy. This guy, I don't know if he'd kill you, but he's not afraid to, to do some damage if he could. At the same time, he's got this vulnerability kind of built into him that I relate to as I get older. I know I'm not as sharp as I was when I was 25 years old. I know I'm not. Now I make up for that in other ways. I've got experience and craft and guile and, and fine, I'm getting through life. But what would that be like if you were 100% sure that at one point you used to be the smartest man in the world, and now you're losing your stuff? You've lost your fastball, right?
Yeah.
What would that be like? And that's sad that he's smart enough to realize he's not as sharp as he used to be. I think I think that's real. And it's certainly real for me. And I think it's real for a lot of people. It's just, man, I used to be able to run a 6-minute mile, or I used to be able to, calculate things in my head, or remember where I put the keys.
Yeah.
And so I think that part's real, that's a very important part of his arc, is this feeling like he's lost his stuff, and maybe toward the end getting a little bit of it back.
Well, like I say, it's beautifully written, and you're right. People are pegged, if you're a certain age, like, oh, you're not going to be able to understand this. A lot of it's pop culture stuff that some older folks will just amaze you at how sharp and with it and on trend they are. But like you've already said, certain things are not quite as quick, more methodical. And other things you're as sharp as ever,
or as evil as ever,
But I just want to make sure to include enough samples of this work and let you give us one last comment. What else would you like folks to know about this book?
Oh gosh, well, honestly, the Last Mechanical Monster is it's a little off-brand for me, because with Mom's Cancer and A Fire Story, I kind of did these quite serious nonfiction works that are emotionally complex in that way, that they're talking about real life serious things that affected people's lives. And The Last Mechanical Monster I did because I had to remind myself that although comics as a medium can be adult and serious and nonfiction, sometimes they ought to just be fun. Mm-hmm. They ought to just be fun to make, fun to read, about fun characters and an old man and his giant robot. And so for me, it was a real, almost a palate cleanser, just a different direction for me that I was interested in pursuing, this sort of just straight up fiction, straight up fun. And when it came time to think about publishing it, I was talking to my editor about exactly this question. I said, well, I'm the Fire Story guy, do you think people, and he said, yes, people are going to need fun. People are going to want fun. These are serious times. But we talked about how, for example, Gone with the Wind and The Wizard of Oz came out right at the start of World War II. couldn't have been a more serious, grim time, but people went to those kinds of movies for that fun and escape and that sort of release from the pressures of the larger world. And if anything, I think my book would serve a purpose like that. The other thing that surprised me is when I came out as a webcomic, how invested readers got into it. People would write me very serious letters about how not only were they into the story, but they really cared about these characters, which surprised me a little bit. But, my favorite example is I got a letter from or an email from a man whose father had recently lost his wife. And the father was just very depressed and very sad. And for obvious reasons, his life partner was gone. And reading my story online was what kind of pulled dad out of it.
Oh.
And because he got into the characters and he wanted to know what happened next, and he was following along, and it kind of pulled him out of his funk. And I didn't expect that, from my fun little robot story. But that's the power of comics, and it's the power of storytelling, and it's a marvelous thing when that kind of thing happens. It means a lot to me.
Well, I can't help but mention whatever happens to the world of tomorrow.
Thank you.
Yeah, this is a companion piece to that.
It is. I seem to have a fondness for that sort of 1920s, 30s, 40s sort of Art Deco, streamlined, modern aesthetic. I don't know what it is about it, but because I was certainly not alive then. But I just love that period and love the art from that period. And the New York World's Fair and these Fleischer cartoons. I think my characters, Cap Crater and the Cosmic Kid, would have a very good hand-to-hand fight with one of these robots from the Last Mechanical Monsters. I think that'd be a very good matchup. So, but yeah, I don't think they inhabit the same universe, but they could. In fact, I've done drawings of exactly that for people, friends. I've done drawings of Cap Crater and the Cosmic Kid, trying to corral one of these mechanical monsters, and it's just they go together. They go together.
Yeah, I mean I think that's definitely part of your brand, part of your wheelhouse. You're an expert on pop culture, the origins of a lot of what is bubbling away in the 30s, 40s is still going on today.
Yeah,
you name it. The Marvel universe, a lot of stuff that people take for granted is they might think is new. It goes back decades.
Oh yeah. Well, I talked just a minute ago about not condescending to old folks. I feel very much the same about old media. There were cartoonists, animators like the Fleischers, but cartoonists like Winsor McKay and Cliff Starrett and all these cartoonists from the 1890s, 1900s, 1910s, 1920s. We're doing amazing, mind-blowing, media-stretching things with a medium, comics, that had just really been invented. If those guys were doing that stuff today, we'd be hailing them as visionary geniuses. They'd be critical darlings, and they were doing it 120 years ago. So I have a great respect for those creative people and the work they produced. And, not all of it holds up, and not all of everything holds up. There are some of those Fleischer Superman cartoons I wouldn't watch because there are a few of them that are pretty racist. They're coming out during the war, but the Mechanical Monsters is just a masterpiece of beauty. And my book, The Last Mechanical Monster, is my kind of appreciation of that masterpiece.
Okay, is there any hint that you could give us about what you're working on now, or?
It's just over here. No, I'm working on a project. I'm not sure what I'm really into it. I mean, I've been working on it for more than a year, so it's in progress. But no, it's something. I'll just say this: it's something I've never seen anybody do in comics before.
Oh wow!
How about that? That's
there
a teaser.
Go. Well, I had to ask because then we can look back a few years from now and see what that special project was.
Well, you'll be the first to know.
Okay. Well,
second or third.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you so much. I always enjoy talking to you, and thanks so much for your support and interest in my work over the years. It's meant a lot to me. Thank you.
Oh, you bet.